Alright, so in order to preface this correctly, I have to insinuate that in order for beings like us to have consciousness, the surrounding universe that we exist in itself has to be capable of sentience in one way or another. So as it goes, nothing existed before anything existed. And because nothing existed, there was no cause for whatever nothing was. Nothing still actually existed, though, as a concept. Maybe not even a concept yet, but there was still nothing there that actually existed. And this was a bit of a hypocrisy that I think caused sentience in the first place. The sort of idea of, if nothing exists, then what is this nothing? This sort of hypocrisy created tension that led to a lot of pressure, that created a lot of heat, until it was realized that nothing itself was indeed something that existed. It started cooling down, and from this cooling arise the first attempts at real somethings, quarks, which turned into neutrons, protons, and electrons, which turned into atoms. But we see that at the beginning, these quarks don't make their proper structures right away. A lot of them try and fail, as it's still too hot for them to make anything happen. And even as they're cooling, they're still getting it wrong somehow. This is an essence of life. Trying to become something is the first thing we notice with quarks that eventually become the materials that make atoms. At first, it seems like these processes are lifeless, simply because they don't have the circulatory systems that we relate to our own being alive. Cellular organisms don't seem too far from molecular organisms. The only difference is the kind of structures that cellular organisms sought to create, the kind of patterns that cellular organisms evolved into. This limitation of an ability to continue expansion created mortality. So these structures that would eventually form atoms and molecules, which led to gases and rocks in space, would eventually form another material that relied on the environment around it to continue its development into an expanded structure. This limitation is what we consider to be mortality in all things. Even the sun is considered dying whenever it reaches the end of its ability to keep going. So this mortality is present in all things, regardless of whether it has flesh or not. Cellular organisms, diseases, viruses are existing materials, not as small as atoms, but small enough not to be detected by the human eye. All it would take is for something to go from an atom to a molecule, continued expansion, into something that starts to have material around it that we don't consider to be like a rock, that continues having to rely on the environment for its survival due to its limitation, its mortality, until, because of whatever environment it's expanding into, it develops traits specific to that area. This would create different kinds of cellular organisms that, if they kept their expansion up, would create what we understand to be different kinds of animals. It could be that these first cellular organisms that we consider to be life were just an offspan, a sort of an irregularity or mutation in the lifeless structures we consider to be atomic or molecular. In order for a structure to continue its expansion, Every single thing it attempted to expand on had to meet a point of self-reliance in order to keep going. With cellular organisms expanding so close to each other with seemingly little immediate resources available in the environment, it would create different kinds of strategies for expansion against other organisms also trying to expand, which is once again where traits came from. These strategies that were an attempt to, well, not, I don't want to say that all traits evolved out of competition. Some traits evolved simply because they were there. Okay, how do I say this? Once a self-reliance is made, more room is given for trait. Meaning that the trait in a state of survival is only necessary in immediate response to some state of challenge or survival. But once self-reliance has been achieved, that trait that was once used for survival is pretty much now made irrelevant as a response, or as a result. These cellular structures eventually turned into bigger structures that were more visible to our naked eye, and these structures are considered animals now, with different traits and different tactics for survival and different patterns for self-reliance, for circulation of existence. Speculating a continued evolving state of sentience in the universe from the idea that nothing was something. Something became so many different things at once that a new category of something had to be defined in order to keep track of itself. This is where ideas like atoms, molecules, cellular organisms, and things came from. These more defined states of something. Holy shit, dude, I'm a genius. With this form of sentience available in what is essentially the core of existence itself, you can say that these organisms would eventually reach a deeper understanding, just as nothing would ever created the original sentience that some people consider to be God. With this continued sentience evolving into something which created different categories of something. Eventually, these organisms that were evolving to create expansion of themselves with each other, which led to different traits and different strategies for survival, would realize their own existence just as nothing was something. And this would create an expansion in their understanding of the environment, now giving these organisms the ability to not just see themselves expanding, but see themselves expanding with one another. This form of self-awareness in organisms would eventually create morality. Imagine that regardless of what kind of organism you are, that you understand that you want to survive, and you eventually realize, oh, these things that I'm competing with also have this desire to survive. Once this self-realized connection is made between enough organisms in a given environment, a new kind of attempt to expand is created between all of these organisms in a group. They all understand that they all want to survive. They all understand that this is something that they share as a group, and they all understand that if they work together, their expansion might occur a little easier. This is essentially what morality is. Morality is when enough self-realized connections are made between organisms in an environment that creates rules designed to protect these agreed upon sensations, connections, desires, or needs. To put it in a really abrupt metaphor, morality can be summed down as saying, holy shit, they're shooting random people down the street. I don't want to get shot, and to them, I would be a random person in this area. So in order to prevent them from coming here and shooting me, who would be a random person to them, I've got to say that them shooting random people down the street is wrong as a self-preserving tactic. So once it was identified between a bunch of organisms in the environment, a shared desire or a shared feeling of a need to survive, a rule was agreed upon by the organisms in that environment, creating what we understand to be the first ethical codes. A sort of flawed behavior, if not continued, by what we understand to be a natural part of our attempt to evolve. So now that these first sort of ethical codes are established, which are now essential parts of existence, because they aren't just there out of some opinionated need to survive, they're there out of a realized connected state of survival between as many organisms as could realize it in the first place. Ethicality itself is not an opinion. It is not something that's being chosen out of a desire to be good out of nowhere. It is something that is necessary for the continued expansion of organisms with as little competition as possible. Animals are still gonna eat each other. We're still gonna eat animals. This is still gonna happen. But we are creating ethical ways to go around it. We're creating ways that, let's be real. After a while, there's a rule that suggests that whenever it comes to just needing to eat, I fucking hate this one. Even then, we could just create, 3D food? I mean, that was a thing that we could do, and we found a way around that, but nobody wanted to do that because they were all like, that shit's gonna make us sick and all this. Doesn't matter. Ethics are a necessary part of survival. They are not simply one organism's attempt to make the environment what it needs to be for its own survival. It's a group of organisms' attempt to make the environment what it needs to be for their survival. This identified shared state of survival, this identified shared state of necessity, is what creates ethics. So, the universe has realized itself again via these organisms that share a state of survival, which created an ethical rule. Once self-reliance is met, enough that a circuit is created via some reliance on the objects around you. Even atoms still have to rely on some source in the universe to keep their existence going. This is just a natural part of everything. Once a self-reliance is made, a manageable circulatory system, an opportunity for a higher state of realization is created. And as time would go on, these realizations would simply be, I have more space to move here. I have more space to do things here. I should experiment with that. And would eventually move on to even higher forms of movement that we can hardly comprehend in a single sentence. Kinds of movement that would had to have established real consciousness. Not just analyzing the environment because I have needs and they need to be met, but seeing things outside of that state of perception simply because we've achieved circulatory system and self-reliance so much that we have more room to think than the environment has to respond to us. In this model, nothing realized it was something, the first sentience to ever start evolving into everything we know today. This continued self-realization would still be identified in all organisms going forward regardless. So, combined with an ethical state of perception and a personal need to survive, religion would expand. A sort of, okay, I get this. The reason that I'm here and the reason that I have these needs is because they're supposed to be met. And this life was designed so that they would be met. This is the first structure of religion. The purpose of religion was to justify the continued expansion of any organism involved. So, organisms would attempt to rationalize with the environment why they have the right to continue moving forward. So, as a new range of movement was met in consciousness, each organism attempted to create a sort of stable state of justified, comfortable existence in which they rationalized an explanation for why they have the natural passage for survival. Maybe this had nothing to do with continued expansion anymore, but just justifying their expansions as they were. The idea of a creator could have simply evolved from the understanding that organisms themselves have to, in some way, create their continued existence. Essentially meaning, let's say these organisms that don't have enough self-awareness attempted to explain where everything came from at once without being able to piece together a logical track from a beginning to now. Their first attempts would always be to realize themselves. And so, as they explained a beginning of some universe, they could only ever go as far as they could understand themselves and their own behavior. So the idea of a creator was essentially this attempt to keep the universe within the grasp of their hands, within their ability to control and proverbially create it. This is why we see so many different versions of a proverbial creator in all religions throughout history. A lot of civilizations would create images in which the creator looked more like their race, and some even created gods that looked nothing like humans. It's very interesting to see. It's very interesting to think about where these ideas came from. You could say, I'm not even going to speculate on that right now. Continuing the discussion of religion and ethics. If you knew that you would never face harm or repercussion for anything you did to anyone in the environment, how would you ever understand right and wrong? The consequences of our action are an essential part of discovering what is right and wrong with the universe. It is natural to the experimentation of ethics. You cannot know something is wrong until you try it and find out that it fucking hurts to do. Now, of course, there are some basic things that naturally come with us, but even then, most of those things are only basic because of the time we have to learn it. A baby learns that they can be hurt very early on. A baby learns that something can hurt them very early on, so now they know that that's something they have to keep track of in the environment to make sure that things aren't going to hurt them if they continue forward. And even then, kids are still reckless despite this early realization. They still have to learn how to not hurt themselves as they go on. And to put it in some sort of like easy observable shape, it would seem that in order for us to really gather an explanation of what we're responding to, we have to reach out as far as we can until something kind of burns us and we have to pull back and just continue taking the risk to get burned in order to figure out what it is we're responding to so that we can actually develop okay, I get what this is now, and start creating some sort of self-relying circuit around it. This is essentially what creates right and wrong. It isn't just a practice of personal idea of opinion of what the right thing to do is. It's what keeps this identified shared connection of survival going, combined with what won't hurt you if you do it. So there are a couple of flaws or fears that I have with this sort of perception of thinking. There's still a bit of life that can't be grasped by the idea. There's a bit of existence that still is just this chaotic nature that goes on whether we like it or not, which is once again what I think creationism evolved for. It was to sort of give us this comfort that even the parts of the universe we didn't have control over, that part of life that would keep going, that was just happening, that you could never do anything about, and that it could just suddenly just be happening to you in a bad way. And that's how it was. That creationism, the idea that there was some God who was controlling things that looked like you, that had your back, could keep that part of life that's just happening from happening to you. So that's really the biggest flaw with this perception of thinking, is that there's this state of things are just happening that you have to accept, which to me is just a natural part of life. At some point, you don't have control over this situation. At some point, you are just responding to it. But with the proper self-reliance and the circuits that we attempt to create and keep these sort of channels flowing, I didn't mean to say channel, in order to keep these circulations flowing to give ourselves space and comfort, we do create a space in which we aren't in a state of response the entire time. And even if we are, it doesn't seem to be in response to anything in the flesh around us.